Thank you for watching this Finance with Excel video. In this video, I'm going to show you how to make a really useful and dynamic foreign exchange rate calculator where I can pick any two currencies, for example, the Brazilian real and any two currencies on my list, and it will give me the exchange rate going from the one to the other. And in addition, it will tell us, for example, one Brazilian real will purchase 1.385 Romanian Nulu. And if I change this, everything changes. Now one Brazilian real will purchase 45.973 Sri Lankan rupees. And then if I click this refresh exchange rates button, it'll go to the internet and it'll update and change the exchange rate. Also right here, we get the exchange rate in the using the currency code. So this is one Brazilian dollars to Sri Lankan rupees. And now if we change, for example, from Brazilian dollars to Bulgarian levs, it changes the exchange rate code right there. So this is a very useful workbook, particularly because it teaches you how to nest equations, because we have to do quite a bit of equation nesting to do this. For example, you can see the equation that we use in right here to get the exchange rate. We have to nest, I think, 4 different types of Excel functions to get this. So it's a very useful way to teach students how to nest equations. So now let's show you how to do it. Okay, the first thing we need to do is we need to get the live exchange rates. Now, typically in a normal world, we would be able to just go to data from existing connections, and then it would pull up, it would give us this MSN Money Center Investor currency rates. But that is currently broken because MSN updated their website, and so this pulls back gibberish. However, we are not without resources. I found another website called xrates.com, which gives us almost exactly the same thing. So if we go to this table right here gives us the current exchange rate for a large list of currencies with the US dollar. And so that is almost exactly what the MSN link used to do. So what we're going to do is we're going to highlight this URL. And then we're going to go back to our Excel and we're going to go to Data from Web. And you always click Yes when this error comes up. It's just saying that the graphics on this page are too complicated for this simple browser, and do you want to continue? So you just click Yes. And then we're just going to paste the exchange rate right there. And it will, or the URL at the top, and then it will bring us to this web page. And everywhere that we see a yellow arrow is something that we can import. And so we just want to import this bottom table because it's the largest list of. They have an abbreviated list of the most common currencies, and then just click yes on all these and yes on all these. And then we just click import. And then it'll say where do you want to put it. Just put it in the top corner. That's just fine. And now it brings in the current exchange rates for all of our different currencies. Next, as kind of good practice, I always like to leave the tab where I'm linked to the internet alone. Because it keeps errors. Because sometimes, for example, if I were to type something into this cell right here, and then I tried to refresh the data, it will oftentimes error because it will say, hey, if I paste my data in here, I'm going to write over something that you've already written, and I don't want to do that, so I'm going to error out the return. So I just, as good practice, just leave my data from the web on a separate tab that I don't ever touch. Data from web. And then what I'll do is I'll just create another tab where I reference all of this data. So I'm just going to click equals data from web, US dollar, and then drag this over to, and then drag this down a bit more. Okay. And so now this data right here is just referenced to the cells in the data from web page. Then it will, if the data from web page values update, they will also update here. The next thing that I want is I'm going to want a lookup table that has each of these currencies along with the ISO currency code. So I'm just going to do equals, I'm just going to reference the currency, And then next to it, I'm going to highlight in gray, because for me, I always highlight inputs in gray, so that way the user knows what they should touch and what they should not touch, so they don't mess up any formulas. Lastly, I'm going to, on the very top of here, and this is because in just a moment we're going to use a list, I'm going to type select. And if you notice, I put this little apostrophe at the very front, and that's because I need Excel to recognize this as text, because if I don't put that apostrophe, Excel won't recognize it as text, and so it'll give me an error. It'll say you're using a minus sign, and I don't understand that. So I just want it to say, no, this is going to be text. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through, so this is just something I have to manually do. It takes maybe 5 minutes, is I just go to the internet and I just Googled ISO currency codes. And I mean, there are 1,000 websites that have them all. This is just one website that gives a list of all the currency codes. And then I just copy and paste, or I just go through each one of these and I put the currency code. So I'm going to pause and do that. Lastly, just for formatting purposes, I'm going to change these names because these I don't feel are tremendously useful. I'm going to put them into what I think is a more useful format, which is USD XXX and then XXX USD. So what this is basically saying is $1 US will buy this many of the foreign currency in this column. And in this column, it's one of the foreign currency will buy this many US dollars. That's how we read these exchange quotes. And this just helps me to think better about what we're doing. Now I'm gonna rename this tab VLOOKUP table. So now we've got all the data that we need for this whole project. We're gonna go build our calculator. The first thing that we're going to do is we're just going to type in base currency and target currency. And this is just the currency that we have, and this is the currency that we want to convert into. So what we want to do is say one of the base currency will buy how many of the target currency. Now we don't have a data on every single currency that exists on the planet. We have a lot of them, and but we don't have every single one of them. So we want to limit the number of the inputs into for this base currency and target currency to the currencies that we have, and we also want this to be the spelling to be exact, so that way we can use VLOOKUPs and things like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight both of these cells, and I'm going to go to Data, and then Data Validation. And then it says, well, what datas would you like to allow? I would like to allow only inputs from a certain list. And where is this list? Well, it's the VLOOKUP tab, and we're going to select everything from the select all the way down to the bottom. And then just click OK. So now, and I'm going to highlight these in green or gray so we know these are inputs. So you notice if I click on this box, it puts a little drop down next to it. Well, so I click on the drop down box and we can see all the lists of currencies that we have. Now I'm going to put select as kind of the default. That way the user knows, and I'm going to center line for formatting, but that way the user knows that this is something they have to go click on and select something. That's why I put the select in there. Because as you notice, when you click away from these cells, the little drop down box that was right here disappears, and so we need to let the users know that these are drop downs. Now if we go to the final product that we created, we noticed that down here we had this exchange rate, where if we change whatever's in any of these things, any of these inputs, it automatically changes the exchange rate and posts it down here. So I'm going to add in so we can see that this is the Croatian kuna and the Sri Lankan rupee. And so I'm going to show you how to build that now. To do that, we're going to use a formula called the concatenate formula. Concatenate is a useful formula. It basically strings together a bunch of different texts and puts them into one thing. So I'm going to use equals concatenate, C-O-N, and so notice it comes right here. It says join several text strings into one text string. And the first text I wanted to say is just exchange rate with a space. Now, the next text that I want it to put is going to end up being the base currency. So the base currency is going to be whatever is in this box right here. But we don't want the formal name of the currency, we just want the currency code. So we're going to use a VLOOKUP, and we're going to use whatever is in this cell as our key, and then we're going to go to our lookup tab, and that's exactly why we did this whole table. But we don't want to highlight the select because the select doesn't have any values for us. And so what it'll do is it'll come back and it'll find the South Korean won and bring back KRW. So VLOOKUP D5, and then we say, well, what column would you like me to bring? Well, this is column 1, column 2. So it says go find whatever D5 is here and bring back whatever is in column 2 in our case. And then we want it to say false. And then I'm going to just finish this so that you can see what what it ends up doing. So you notice when we go back to this table or this tab right here, we have an NA. Well, that's simply because select is not in our lookup table. And so, but if we were to select, for example, Bahraini dinar, it says exchange rate BHD. And so this is working the way we want it to work. However, we need to add a couple of more texts here. So I'm just going to go back into my concatenate function. I'm going to put a comma to say this is the next piece of text. I'm going to use a parenthesis / parenthesis. And then if we look at what this ends up giving us, we can see it's exchange rate BHD /. Now, as you may have guessed, the last thing we're going to do is we're going to use this VLOOKUP command again, except for instead of D5 being the lookup key, it's going to be D6. And so, actually, to save time, I'm just going to copy this, and I'm going to paste it right here at the end, and then I'm just going to change that to D6. And when I hit enter, we see once again it gives us an error because select is not in our VLOOKUP list, and that's okay. Now, but I can now click the Japanese yen, and it will give me JPY. You might be asking the question, well, why didn't I just include select in there? Well, that's because I want to, because if I did, and because select has a blank, if we go to the VLOOKUP table, select has a blank next to it, you could say, well, why not just return a blank? Well, I'm just doing it because it's a little bit cleaner this way, because if I did it that way, if I included select, then it would say exchange rate, blank, and we'd still have this dash here, so we just have a random dash floating around. And there's another way that I want to handle this. I'm going to use an if error function. So I'm going to say if error, and an if error function just says if error, so look at this value. If this value right here returns an error, well, then give me something else. And I'm going to say just give me a blank. And you just do a blank by doing two parentheses, or two quotation marks. And then I hit enter and enter. So now if one of these, if we go back to select, it just blanks out. And it disappears. But if we have a currency in there, it gives us the currency. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to now click Wrap Text, and I want to center align all of these just to make them look prettier. So now we've got this nice exchange rate, AUD JPY. This cell right here is the most complicated formula that we're going to put in our function, but it's not conceptually tremendously difficult. Now, we don't actually have the actual Australian dollar Japanese yen exchange rate. Let's actually just use Argentine peso and Australian dollar, just because it'll be easier to show you when I go to the VLOOKUP tab. So we don't have the Argentine peso Australian dollars. So what we want to say is how many Australian dollars will one Argentine peso purchase? So if we go to our lookup tab, where we have our exchange rates data, we don't have that exchange rate, but we do know, we say $1 US will buy about 9 Argentine pesos, and $1 US will buy about 1.25 Australian dollars. So we can easily calculate how many Australian dollars one Argentine peso will produce, and it's just simply going to be 1.25 divided by 8.89 is going to be how many Argentine peso, or how many Australian dollars one Argentine peso will produce. So in this case, it would be 1.25 divided by 8.995. So it would be 1.4. And this would be the ARS AUD exchange rate right here. So we need to create a formula that does that. But we also notice that the US dollar can be one of the currencies that we select. But US dollar does not exist here simply because US dollar would just be a 1 and a 1. There are a couple ways we can handle it. I will show you one of them. The way I'm going to show you is just to use an if statement. Now, if we go back to our sheet, really what we want is we want the Australian dollar exchange rate divided by the Argentine peso exchange rate. But if either of these is US dollar, we need them to be just a 1. So we're just going to we're going to start using an if statement. If, and remember it's the Australian dollar divided by Australian dollar rate divided by the Argentine peso rate. So we're going to say if the target currency is equal to US dollar, then I want you just to return a 1. If that's not the case, so if we're not dealing with US dollar, then we're going to use a VLOOKUP. And our value is going to be this Australian dollar. And then we're going to go to our lookup, but this time we're going to be looking up from this table right here. And then, make sure on this case you have to anchor it because we're going to drag this formula down and you don't want to be dragging your table down as you do it. So we anchor it. We want it to bring back what's in cell 2 or what's in column 2, and then false, we want an exact match. And so I'll show you what this is going to bring back. And so I just closed my if statement and I hit enter, and you can see it brought back the Australian dollar exchange rate, 1.25, 1.25. Now, if this were the US dollar, it would bring back a 1. So this is great. This is working just like we wanted it to. Now, the next thing we want to do is we want to divide this by, now we're just going to do this exact formula again, so we can just copy and paste it. But instead of being D6, because D6 is this cell, we can just change this to be a D5. And then we change it in both cases. And then we just hit enter. And so now it gives us the Australian peso US dollar exchange rate, which if we go to our VLOOKUP is the Australian dollar USD exchange rate. It calculated it for us correctly. So we can be happy. The next thing that we want to do is we're going to use the round function because this has a lot of decimal places. And I mean, you would think, well, why don't we just format it to get rid of these decimal places? Well, the reason is because if you look back to our completed one where we had right here, for example, in this case, one Croatian kuna will purchase 19.202 Sri Lankan rupee. Well, if we don't round to 3 decimal places, then this would say 19.202 and it would have like 12 decimal places behind it, which is not tremendously useful. So we need to use the round function to stop the exchange rate at 3 decimal places. So all we're going to do is we're just going to wrap this entire function in round. So we're just going to say round. And it's going to say the number, and we want to round it to the 3rd decimal place. And then we hit enter. And now we're going to do conditional formatting, and so we can just now we have that. Now we're going to center line it. Now one thing we're going to notice is that if we're back on select, this gives us an error again. So how to solve that? Well, we're just going to wrap this function again in an if error statement. And so we're going to say if this function gives us an error, then just return a blank. Great. Now the last thing that we need to do is we need to create our little arrow that tells us that, for example, 1 Argentine peso will buy 0.11 US dollars. And so to do this, we're going to once again use the concatenate Now this one's a lot simpler, so we're going to say concatenate. And then the first thing that we're going to put in our concatenate is I'm just going to put an arrow. 1, an arrow with a 1. And then, so we're going to say 1, and then we need to make sure we have a space at the end. 1 Argentine peso will purchase, and then comma, space, will purchase, with another space at the end, because you have to put your spaces into the text, this many, and then we need to add a space of this currency. And lastly, I'm going to put an S at the end, so that way we know it's dollars or rupees or whatever. And so then I just hit enter, and it says 1 Argentine peso will purchase 11 or 0.112 US dollars. Now we have this thing. So for example, now what do we do if one of these is select? Well, now it says select, and we don't actually want that. So we're gonna wrap this in an if statement. We're just gonna ask the question, if this cell right here is blank, so equals a blank, then I want you to return a blank. If not, then use this concatenate function. And I hit enter. Last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight this, or I'm just going to put a box around this, like that. I'm going to make this like that, and then re-highlight those in gray, and drag this down a little bit. There we go. So now if I select any two currencies, it gives me all the information that I want. But now we want to put this more center aligned, like centered in the cell, the home alignment, and then we're going to use this button right here, which centers the text vertically in the cell that we want. The last thing that we need to do is add the button down here to refresh our exchange rates. And that's very simple to do. So we go to our developer tab. If you don't have the developer tab, you go to File, you go to Options, you go to Customize Ribbon, and then you click on this developer tab. You check this developer tab to make sure that it's done. Now once you go, then you go to the developer tab and you click Record Macro, and then we're going to call this macro. We're going to call this macro Refresh. And we want to store this macro in this workbook only. And then now Excel is recording every keystroke and every click that we do. Now I'm just going to go to Data, and I'm going to go to Refresh All, and I'm just going to click this Refresh All button. And we're going to notice this should change once it thinks for a little bit. Or maybe it won't. So once I've clicked Refresh All, then I just go back to my developer, I click Stop Recording, and then I go to this insert and I insert a button. And then it says, well, what macro would you like to assign to this button? Well, we're going to assign the refresh macro to this button. We're going to call this refresh rates. And now if we go to, for example, and now we have our entire workbook. If we click this button, it will refresh. Let me move this a little bit more over. Now the last thing to remember is when you save this, go to File, Save As. You have to save it as because right now it saves Save As type. You have to save it as an Excel macro-enabled workbook, and then we'll call this workbook Exchange Rate Calculator, and then we're done. And this is the workbook. So thank you for joining us.